has yet another tool in his toolkit with which to construct the historical record, namely science. And as an art historian, I find myself envious of yet this other aspect of his training that allows him to learn and reconstruct an historical record that brings together in his own research a whole slew of varied perspectives, which we've all learned from our time at the Academy is how we really can begin to see the full picture. So please join me in welcoming Greg Bailey, who tonight will share with us his perspective on multivalent objects, the conservation of pastiche artworks. Thank you.
Thank you, Lindsay, for the very kind introduction. Just as I begin, I would like to emphasize that though I will be speaking about work that I have done while at the Walters Art Museum, my contract ended just before I arrived here, so I'm no longer officially affiliated with the museum, although it remains very dear to me. So, on that note, I'd like to begin by saying that for the past several years, as you have heard, I've worked as a bench conservator, tasked with treating objects for exhibition and loan. So really for 4 years now, I've treated an average of about 100 or so objects a year, which is roughly one object every 2.5 days, a regimen that has kept me very focused on the material aspects of art. What is it made of? How is it made? How has it changed over time? Consequently, I came here to Rome with object-specific questions about materials and techniques, but quickly came to find that these were perhaps not the right questions to ask of the Eternal City, or at least not at first. My experiences in the brief time that I have been here have borne me back ceaselessly into the past to more fundamental questions about how the theory and practice of conservation, and the much longer tradition of restoration, intersect with art objects to change not just their physical states, but their meanings as well. So this evening I would like to present my work on 2 objects from the Walters collections as case studies in the conservation process, but also as challenges to the notion of authenticity and to the process of conservation itself. So the first object I would like to consider is a large bowl, measuring 27 by 32 centimeters, catalogued as late 15th century Venetian, constructed of enameled copper, ornamented with dense patterns of textured gilding. Curator of Renaissance and Baroque art, Dr. Jonice Spicer, and Mellon Curatorial Fellow, Dr. Eva Helfenstein, selected this object among others for a partial reinstallation of a gallery within the museum in 2012. As I began to evaluate the condition of this object, I noted several signs of deterioration and possible alteration over time. Most problematically, the bowl did not stand safely on its own, which is why you see it here upside down. The interior structure that united the bowl, knop, and foot had been weakened or damaged, causing the heavy bowl to rock against the top of the foot, where a gilded copper mount had crushed the enamel and restoration material, exposing the underlying copper form, as you see there. Intact examples of multi-part enamels of this type, such as this monstrance reliquary, are assembled around central tubes of rolled copper sheet, which you see here, secured at one end by split tabs and mechanically secured at the other by helical catches or twisted wire cams that are snugged against false feet that are enameled to the underside of the vessel. So computed X-ray tomography of the, radiography, of the bowl revealed a complex internal structure with clear signs of alteration. A central rolled tube appeared to be present on the interior, but it had been augmented with a much longer section of modern machine-made pipe. The entire structure was held together by a thin, threaded post secured at the bottom with a modern nut. The underside of the foot was then filled with plaster, and a separate circular button of enameled copper was set in place to cover the repair. Visual examination of the medallion at the center of the bowl and the inset button on the underside associated with the structural repair suggested that they were not original to the manufacture of the object, as they differed in both material and technique. 3 campaigns of restoration paint had been added to disguise damages to the enamel, and these had deteriorated over time, appearing dark and opaque. The enamel surfaces were coated in an uneven layer of dirt and grime, and drips of an unknown surface coating were present on the exterior, visible here under long-wave ultraviolet radiation. Under binocular magnification, it appeared that the surface coating was contracting, pulling some of the delicate remaining gilding away from the enamel surface. Interestingly, no original gilding remained on the knob. Instead, the previously gilded motifs appeared as faint pink stains on the enamel, which you can see most clearly here in the white. The surface overall had a stunned matte appearance that was very different from the glossy appearance of the enamel elsewhere on the object. This fractured, frosty appearance on the knob and the pink staining corresponding to previously gilded motifs are both consistent with an episode of poorly controlled reheating, which disrupted the surface of the enamel and burned off much of the gold leaf, causing a small amount of nanoparticulate gold to diffuse into the enamel surface, resulting in a pink cast. The intentional use of nanoparticulate gold to color glass and enamel either red or pink is known from the late 17th century onward, but here, the evidence strongly points to an unintentional cause for the pink staining, possibly due to a so-called hot repair, such as soldering to repair damages to the underlying copper form. With this information in hand, I prepared a report, and in close consultation with the curatorial staff, a plan for stabilizing the structure, cleaning the surfaces, and harmonizing the multiple campaigns of restoration was agreed upon. The bowl was disassembled and surfaces were cleaned to reduce dirt, grime, and the contractile coating. In order to gain a better understanding of how the parts of the object related to one another, enamel surfaces were analyzed by X-ray fluorescence spectrometry, known in common parlance as XRF. Briefly, XRF is a non-invasive qualitative method of analysis that yields information on elements present on the surface of an object. Working with Walters Art Museum research scientist Dr. Glenn Gates, enamel surfaces on each constituent part of the bowl were analyzed. XRF analysis of the medallion and button confirmed that the composition and colorants of the enamel were consistent with 19th or early 20th century manufacture. Analysis of the bowl, knop, and foot identified compositions and colorants consistent with 15th or 16th century manufacture. Intriguingly, the element molybdenum, and you see peaks for that here, was identified in the cobalt blue enamels of all three components, that is, the bowl, the knop, and the foot. Molybdenum is a very rare impurity associated with some cobalt ores extracted from mines in what is today central Germany during the late 15th and early 16th centuries. The identification of this impurity is therefore significant, as it provides a rough dating indicator, and also suggests that these three components were all created with enamel made from the same batch of cobalt ore. The presence of gilded motifs stamped with the same set of tools on each of these components further suggests that they were likely made in the same workshop. These details are significant because art historical comparisons conducted by Dr. Eva Helfenstein with other known examples of so-called Venetian enamel on copper objects suggest that the foot may have originally belonged to a high-standing cup or a taza. The knop may have formed part of a large candlestick or torchère, and the bowl may originally have rested on a lower single-part foot. The extension and alteration of the internal structure of the bowl appears to confirm this interpretation. Based on this combination of art historical, analytical, and material evidence, it seems likely that the bowl in its current configuration is a pastiche created from fragments of three separate but authentic objects made around 1500 within the same workshop and sharing a long history of association. These were later restored and completed with additional components in the 19th and early 20th centuries. The second object I would like to consider is a large glazed terracotta relief depicting Adam and Eve in a scene of the Temptation. Measuring approximately 2.8 by 2.1 meters, the relief has been on continuous display in Baltimore since 1909, when Henry Walters completed his private art gallery. Attributed to Giovanni della Robbia and his workshop, the relief has been dated to 1515 and associated with the triumphal entry of the Medici Pope Leo X into Florence on the 30th day of November of that year, on the basis of the inscription along the lower edge of the relief. This inscription is quite literally underlined by the coats of arms of Leo X in the center, and those of his relatives and political allies, the Buondelmonti and Salviati families. The relief is currently located in a high-traffic area on a shallow stair landing that you see on the right here, between floors. This prominent location renders the object highly visible from a distance both inside and, unusually, outside of the museum. Yet it is also very vulnerable to damage. Unfortunately, in 2013, a palm-sized section of the fig leaf at Adam's waist disappeared, likely as a result of accidental damage. Despite a thorough search of gallery spaces, the fragment was not located. In preparing a damage report and an initial examination, it quickly became clear that many other small fragments were loose or partly detached and at risk of loss. Surfaces had last been cleaned superficially 10 years before, and a significant accumulation of dirt and grime had obscured the original color and gloss of the ceramic glaze. Remnants of a discolored, non-original wax coating remained in many areas, trapping dirt and contributing to the uneven appearance. Multiple campaigns of fill and restoration paint had been added to the surfaces over the years, and they no longer harmonized well with each other. Additionally, the large size, extreme complexity, and difficult location of the relief had limited prior documentation efforts and contributed to some difficulties in assessing and responding to the new damage. In consultation with the curator, who was again Dr. Joni Spicer, the decision was made to address the immediate damage in an efficient and reversible way, and then to revisit other issues at a later date. I quickly consolidated the loose fragments along the break edge, and within a day had fabricated a removable fill of laminated paper. At the time, we both held out hope that the missing fragment might be located, though to this day it has not. Using my time as a Mellon Fellow in conservation, I embarked on a more thorough campaign to document the current condition of the relief through photographs and written reports. On further discussion with Dr. Spicer and others in the museum, it was decided to undertake a surface cleaning to reduce dirt and grime, remove traces of the uneven and non-original wax coating, and reduce excess restoration material covering original glazed surfaces. This was all undertaken with the goal of increasing the overall cleanliness and revealing as much of the original surface as possible. As I began reducing the many layers of plaster and paint that had been added, it became clear that the central scene was assembled from many sections of very severely damaged terracotta. The largest sections had been repaired by pinning or stapling with iron rods, and they're in these kind of butterfly joins that you see here. Many of these appear to align along original joins, and this is my best guess at what some of the original joins might have been. The center of the relief and the upper register of the leaves, going back again, consist of misaligned fragments with no clear join edges and appear to be held in place with plaster alone. The gaps between them have been filled with additional plaster and painted to integrate them. Several small fragments of original glazed terracotta are clearly out of place and seem to have been inserted merely to fill gaps among the larger pieces. Similarly, the text on the predella also contains gaps and dislocations that had previously been obscured by overpaint, indicating that it should be read as a fragmentary and incomplete text. Perplexingly, it quickly became apparent that two different types of glazed terracotta fragments were incorporated into the relief. The majority of the fragments consisted of buff-colored terracotta glazed with a single opaque layer of glaze. These, on the whole, were visually consistent with glazed terracotta produced in the Della Robbia workshops. The second, which are highlighted in green here, were small but still substantial number of fragments made from reddish terracotta that were glazed overall in a white ground, over which a second layer of separately fired semi-translucent glaze was applied in a brushy, impressionistic manner. You can see that here in this purple fig and the kind of very variegated leaf there. Working again with Dr. Glenn Gates, I performed XRF spectrometry, oh goodness, and the spectrum has disappeared. Take my word for it. On glazed surfaces of the two different sets of glazed terracotta using portable instrumentation loaned by Brooker Scientific and Aleo XRF. Analysis of similarly colored glazes on the two sets of terracotta consistently identified differences between the two. Glazed surfaces on the buff-colored terracotta fragments were found to have compositions and colorants consistent with published data on Della Robbia glazes, whereas glazed surfaces on the reddish-colored terracotta were found to have colorants consistent with manufacture in the 19th century. In particular, and this is what this arrow is showing you. In particular, the identification of chromium, very significantly right here, in green glazes argues strongly for the 19th century origins of these fragments, as chromium is not known to have been used as a colorant for vitreous materials until after about 1800. Concurrent with my documentation, treatment, and analysis of the relief, I was also pursuing, so here we have, again, kind of getting back to the complexity of this object, breaks and losses in red, dislocated fragments which are hard to see, but some of these kind of floating up there, stuck in the corner, this little tip of the corn here, original joins possibly outlined in blue, and then the 19th century pieces that consistently contained compositions that weren't known to have been used before about 1800. So concurrent with all of this documentation, treatment, and analysis, I was pursuing kind of on and off provenance research, just in an effort to understand why this object is so complex. Henry Walters was known to have purchased the relief at auction through an intermediary at auction in Paris in 1902 from the estate of the widow of the Parisian collector Camille Lelong. The catalog for the sale includes an image of the relief, which you see here on the right, where it appears visibly damaged and grimy. The text of the inscription, if you're very observant, is installed in a different configuration, and the entry in the catalog notes that it is incomplete. This information seems to have been lost over time. And here I indicate the 5 areas where there's very clear indications that there's missing text. Lelong, in turn, had purchased the relief from Adele Ristori, a woman who lived in Valdarno, in 1886, and this despite efforts by Italian authorities to bar the export of the relief. The scholar Alan Marquand, writing in the 1920s, recalls seeing the relief in 1884 in the shop of a Florentine antiques dealer Angelo Capelli in the Via Borgo Ognissanti. Intriguingly, and this came to light after some very intensive Googling, in December of 1870, the relief was in the hands of one V. Capelli, who's presumably either the same person as Angelo Capelli or a close relation, in Florence. And he shipped it to the South Kensington Museum in London with a man named C. Ferrario acting as courier. The relief was offered for sale to the South Kensington at the considerable price of £1,000 sterling. No photographic records of its condition are known to survive. However, it is described in some detail in a technical report written for the South Kensington Museum by Matthew Digby Wyatt, as well as in the 1871 January and February issues of the Art Journal London. These descriptions leave no doubt as to the identity of the relief. The written descriptions of the appearance and condition of the object reveal that the newly made glazed terracotta restorations were in place at that time, as well as the initial campaign of tinted plaster and paint. Digby Wyatt had the benefit of examining the object in several pieces, with differences in the color of the clay bodies, as well as the extent of plaster and paint restoration quite visible on the reverse. He summed up his views thus, and it's in his handwriting here. I think a little of this is old and a great deal quite modern. I recommend the department have nothing whatsoever to do with this specimen. Its price is very large, and in my opinion, its authenticity is questionable. It is much made up with plaster and colored, not fired, in many places. Various pieces are made with quite different, at any rate 2 different kinds of clay, and color has been applied in many places to make new material appear old. The South Kensington declined to purchase the relief, and it was shipped back to Florence in February of 1871. So this I discovered after all of my own examination and analysis. So this pushes the date of these restorations back to about 1870. So based on this accumulated evidence, it seems very likely that the relief was reconstructed in the 19th century, probably in Italy around 1870 or slightly before, from an incomplete collection of fragments from a larger 16th century monument, working from the largest to the smallest sections and then completing the assemblage with newly made pieces of glazed terracotta. The restorers created a reduced version of the original that strongly privileged the sculptural qualities of the 2 figures. And here, again, that I think begins to explain why this object has such a complex physical state. So how are we to consider these objects? Cesare Brandi, writing in his enormously influential collection of treatises published in 1963 as Teoria del Restauro, condemns, quote, misguided repairs and new adaptations as aesthetic and historical frauds, end quote. And elsewhere he characterizes, quote, the degradation of a monument dismantled and reconstructed elsewhere to a fake of itself, obtained by using its own materials so that it is even less than a mummified corpse would be to a living person. Brandi argues that artworks tainted by a loss of authenticity or of original context ought to be rejected outright. This common and oft-repeated view seeks to excise pastiches and forgeries from the art historical record lest they contaminate our understanding of the true, authentic works. Though this is perhaps a natural point of view, certainly no one wishes to be deceived, it is to my mind simplistic. Yet, as is true of much of Brandi's dense and wide-ranging writings on conservation theory, the issue of compromised authenticity is taken up elsewhere and considered from a rather different point of view, enabling a more nuanced consideration of their potential value. Copies, imitations, and falsifications mirror the cultural look of the moment in which they were made. They enjoy a dual historical nature because they were produced at a given time and because they inadvertently bear witness to the tastes, trends, and fashions of the time. A fake can mirror a particular way or reading of a work of art and of deducing the style that was in vogue during a given period. The emphasis is in the original. Since Brandi's time, this understanding of compromised artworks as documents of dual historical nature has become more common and is featured in publications on authenticity and conservation theory by Paul Craddock, Salvador Muñoz-Viñas, Paul Filippo, among others. So with your indulgence, I would like to consider the multiple significances of these artworks, that is, the ways in which they might be read. So to return to the Venetian bowl. The American industrialist, collector, and philanthropist Henry Walters, like many of his better-known contemporaries in the late 19th century, such as Henry Clay Frick and J.P. Morgan, whom you see here, was engaged in the task of creating a princely collection to rival or even surpass those of the great patrons and collectors of Europe. Walters, building on the collection of paintings, sculptures, and East Asian ceramics begun by his father, acquired tens of thousands of art objects during the course of his adult life, constructing a Florentine-style Renaissance palazzo to house his personal collections and filling it with furnishings and interiors that readily combined authentic originals with reproductions. The result was a simulacrum of the great aristocratic collections of Europe, in which modern elements and historical styles were used to bridge gaps among artworks from different times and places, as well as physically unite disparate elements of architecture transported from elsewhere. Though heroic fragments, such as those of antique sculpture, might feature among such display, and indeed have a long history in aristocratic collections, many damaged fragments of decorative art, merely damaged fragments of decorative art, did not have a place among such opulent and unified exhibition, demonstrating as they did not only the taste and expertise of their owners, but their power and wealth as well. As a form of conspicuous consumption in artistic as well as material terms, artworks destined for major American collections needed to be beautiful, rare, and complete in order to fit into the opulent schema of their household decor and personal museums. As this invoice for the Venetian enamel bowl shows, which came to light months after my treatment of it, seemingly without prior request or authorization, the Paris art dealer Jacques Seligman passed along the damaged object to the restorer Alfred André, who could fulfill, presumably, the wishes of Henry Walters without any direct communication. The bowl thus stands in for the complex network of economic, social, and intellectual exchange that enabled the formation of the great American art collections of the 19th century. But the current structure of the bowl, as it was restored by André, tells us more specific things about how this type of enamel object was understood at the turn of the 20th century. The attribution of the enamel on copper objects to Venice seems to have emerged in the middle of the 19th century, when several examples were described in auction catalogs as Venetian rather than merely Italian. Attribution was probably considered to be codified by Louis Courajod in 1885 in a publication in the Gazette Archéologique. The addition of the medallion with the coat of arms, whether by André or a previous 19th century restorer, together with the label on the underside, the Arms of Mocenigo, emphasizes the object is to be understood as a Venetian, and that a link to one of the great families of Venice enhanced the perceived value of the object. The coat of arms is not, in fact, that of the Mocenigo, and the label misspells the family name, but the presence of these two additions bespeaks a strong interest in constructing a tangible link to a Venetian past through an invented or possibly reinforced provenance. Many similar objects bear coats of arms, some of which are gilded directly onto the enamel and some of which are present as separately applied medallions. The creation of the enamel medallion with the putatively a Venetian coat of arms thus bespeaks some familiarity with other objects of the type, but also serves as an ingenious and deceptive way to camouflage the newly inserted mechanical connection among the various parts of the object. However, the painted gilding on the medallion differs significantly in technique from the original, which appears to have been made through the use of small textured stamps similar to movable type. Moreover, the insertion of an enameled button onto the underside of the foot is an anachronism. As previously discussed, original connections on this type of enamel employ helical wire catches or cams. Enameled buttons inserted to the undersides of feet are a feature typical of enamel on copper objects from Limoges. This construction technique was known to restorers and artists working in historical styles in the 19th century, as this Taza, also incidentally repaired by Alfred André, shows. It very skillfully replicates the original construction technique. The restorations to the bowl thus show evidence of an emerging art historical understanding of objects of this type as specifically Venetian, and some awareness of the fact that they often feature coats of arms. Yet the restorations also demonstrate an inability to replicate the textured gilding of the original enamel, and some confusion as to original construction techniques, substituting instead representations of the far more common and familiar construction techniques of enamel made in Limoges ateliers. The bowl as it is currently assembled thus embodies significant information about the art historical, material, and technical understanding of so-called Venetian enamel on copper objects around 1900. Returning again to the Adam and Eve, how can we read this incredibly complex object? The very large price tag in the proposed sale to the South Kensington, which was actively building a collection of Renaissance glazed terracotta sculpture, suggests some mercenary intent on the part of the dealer Capelli, and it raises the possibility that the relief was purposely reconstructed in order to appeal to late 19th century English taste in maiolica and what was then termed Della Robbia ware. By 1870, the South Kensington Museum had amassed a collection of 49 glazed Renaissance terracottas variously attributed to members of the Della Robbia family, largely due to the work of the curator John Charles Robinson. Robinson pursued the acquisition of these objects with particular zeal, arguing that they exemplified the newly defined category of decorative art, partaking equally of the craft aspects of ceramics and the art aspect of sculpture. Robinson, in his influential 1862 publication, Italian Sculpture of the Middle Ages and the Period of Revival of Art, positions his discussion of Luca della Robbia and glazed terracotta midway between discussions of marble sculpture and painted maiolica vessels. Indeed, his description of the evolution of Luca's career is presented in somewhat confused chronological order in an effort to emphasize that Luca was foremost a sculptor of marble who later adapted the materials of glazed terracotta in an austere palette of blue and white, when in fact the truth is much more complicated. Robinson's presentation of Luca is influenced to a great extent by the 19th century theories of his friend and colleague John Ruskin, who later argued for the ideal of an artist craftsman, and in his later career exalted Luca della Robbia as an exemplar of this type. Robinson's situation of Renaissance glazed terracotta is midway between sculpture and maiolica, and somehow directly in conversation with modern majolica wares, extended to the installation of the museum itself, in which the Della Robbia reliefs were positioned between galleries of ceramics and marble, and intermingled with occasional products of the Minton manufactory, such as the monumental Italianate Jardiniere exhibited at the 1855 Paris Exposition Universelle. And here, if you look closely, you can make out some of the glazed terracottas in the North Court around 1870. The stark white figures produced by the Della Robbia workshops were particularly prized, as they could easily be presented as surrogates for white marble sculpture and were thus agreeable to the general taste for monochromatic forms established in the 18th century by Winkelmann and upheld by Ruskin a century later, who judged that the truest grandeur of sculpture to be in the white form. Perhaps the most direct expression of this taste can be found in the monumental glazed terracotta Minton staircase installed at the South Kensington between 1865 and 1871, in which the architectural and sculptural forms are pure white, whereas the subsidiary decorative forms are glazed in colors, thus codifying the Victorian hierarchy of colors and forms in a great glazed terracotta relief. So in material, technique, and execution, the reconstruction and restoration of the Adam and Eve mirrors this understanding of glazed terracotta as intermediate on a hierarchy between art and craft, between polychromatic maiolica vessels and the art of pure white marble sculpture. The low-relief polychromatic vegetation and animals of the background, here we see a close-up, are treated as subordinate decorative elements, which are neither assembled in a coherent manner nor restored to complete all of the missing forms, thus reducing their significance and minimizing their presence to a sort of jumbled taco salad that you see here. The high relief of the classicizing pure white figures, however, are completed in all their details, adding limbs, digits, and even attributes where necessary. And here you see an added arm. And these completions of the figures really emphasize their presence within the relief. Several of the restorations on the relief appear somewhat questionable in terms of their interpolated forms, which suggests that the restorers were unaware of the original appearance of the relief. For example, the proper right arm of Adam awkwardly invades the trunk of an adjacent tree. The coils of the serpent ascend at lower angles than the originals. The restoration to Eve's inner proper right arm has positioned her hand above the original location. And the indistinct ears of yellow grain that are painted elsewhere on the relief have been clearly articulated as an ear of corn here, much to the bafflement of modern scholars. And furthermore, the tangle of fig leaves around the waists of the two figures, and this is one of the questions that I was frequently asked, is, are these original? They are, in fact, 19th century restorations. However, as Shakira might say, these hips don't lie. While these, you see, kind of very sketchy-looking leaves are the 19th century restorations, this much lighter uniform color leaf is glazed directly to Eve's proper left hip. And there are some other indications here as well that there were, in fact, foliage present in that position and that they were, in fact, fig leaves. The 19th century restorations in glazed terracotta are remarkably well fitted to the break edges and joins of the original fragments. This suggests that they may have been modeled on the original surfaces and separated for firing or glazing before returning them to the relief. Similar methods for completing fragmentary ceramic vessels, particularly ancient terracottas, by either throwing or building a section of new ceramic directly on the original, were a common feature of 19th century restorations. Yet while the restorations to complete the figures are executed in glazed terracotta, they are pinned to the original in the manner of marble sculpture and are covered with a thick layer of tinted wax, a very common restorer's technique for uniting the surfaces of different kinds of marble, evidence of borrowing from the long tradition of restoring classical marble sculpture. The materials and techniques of the restoration, as well as its overall result, seem not only calculated to appeal to English tastes in collecting, as exemplified by the South Kensington, but indeed seem to be predicated upon an understanding of glazed terracotta as partaking of both the craft of maiolica and the art of sculpture. So based on documentary evidence, it is most likely that the reconstruction and restoration of the relief was conducted in Italy, most likely in or around Florence. It is possible that the antiques dealer V. Capelli orchestrated the campaign. The Florentine collector dealer Stefano Bardini also comes to mind, as he is known to have overseen somewhat deceptive restorations and sold fragmentary glazed terracottas to collector in France and elsewhere, although there is no direct documentary evidence linking him to the Adam and Eve. It is not possible at present to attribute the restoration glazed terracotta to a particular workshop, but it is worth mentioning that several Italian ceramic manufactories, including Ginori and Cantagalli, were actively reproducing Della Robbia wares in the later 19th century, and the Cantagalli workshop is also known to have restored other fragmentary reliefs in a very similar fashion but much later in the 20th century. So it is hoped that further provenance research, in combination with the examination and analysis of similar restorations, may yield additional information on when, where, and by whom the relief was reconstructed and restored. So the origins of the Adam and Eve relief remain relatively obscure, and there is not much that might be said about its prior states with any given certainty beyond the fact that it seems to have been severely damaged at some point in time and may have lain in fragments for an extended period before its reconstruction. So given these further explorations of the kind of multiplicity of states and complex historical meanings of these two objects, I would like to return to the question of how they are to be considered. The examination and material analysis of these artworks indicates that they are both pastiches. The Venetian bowl is a combination of authentic fragments from separate artworks to create a new object. The Adam and Eve is a reconstruction incorporating fragments of the original and newly made sections in an historical style. The language used to describe such compromised artworks carries with it a host of connotations that are not always fully examined, and yet subtly influence the ways in which artworks are understood and valued. So far, I have used the words compromised and pastiche to refer to these objects which, while technically accurate, carry some negative connotations. Brandi's teoria, which we considered earlier, introduced two other common forms of language for the discussion of artworks altered by prior restoration that are also often applied to the theory and practice of modern conservation, that is, corporeal and textual. I've chosen this wonderful artwork on the Palatine Hill because it is both a textual installation that carries with it the language of the body. One of the most pervasive metaphors employed in the discussion of restoration and conservation is that of the body, living, dead, artificially preserved, or reanimated. The origins of the corporeal language used to discuss the conservation of artworks are myriad, from Ruskin's insistence that restoration is as impossible as the resurrection of the dead, to Brandi's restored monuments as less than mummified corpses, to more recently Salvador Munoz Viñas's assertion that ad hoc restoration campaigns create Frankenstein's monsters. The use of the language of the body to describe artworks is perhaps a natural extension of the highly personal and emotional response that many of us feel in the presence of great works of art. Yet it anthropomorphizes inanimate objects in ways that inflect their conservation with moral issues germane only to the relationship among living beings. The historical prevalence of the mummy and the reanimated corpse as metaphor for the restoration and conservation of artworks evidences a distinct unease with artificial preservation and with a profession whose technical proficiency is sometimes perceived as having overstepped its moral bounds. The conservation of artworks seeks to preserve them for an undefined future. Though there is no practical expectation that any particular artwork will last for eternity, it is an easy theoretical or metaphorical leap from the act of conservation to the hubris of seeking immortality or the uncanny animation, or indeed reanimation, of dead matter. Alternatively, the text is often invoked as a paradigm for the interpretation and hence the conservation of artworks. Artworks may be read, as we have just seen, as in Brandi's discussion of forgeries and imitations. Prior restorations or appropriations may result in palimpsest objects, as we say. Additions or interpolations are said to fill lacunae. Yet as Paul Philippot has rightly pointed out, the textual model falsely conflates the information conveyed by text with the material in which it is written, or in the case of visual art, the image of the artwork with the structures by which it is formed. Thus, while it is possible to preserve the information of a text through transcription and philological study, the same cannot be said of a physical work of art. Neither of the artworks under consideration can be comfortably accommodated into either the corporeal or the textual schema. Considered as living bodies, the bowl might be judged a Frankenstein's monster, reassembled from parts of other objects. The relief as likewise an unnatural resurrection of a lost monument. Considered as text, both the bowl and the relief can only be judged as helplessly corrupted by transposition, recombination, and the false interpolation of lacunae. A pastiche cannot be regarded as a mere palimpsest either, simply acquiring layered meaning, but it must be viewed as an accumulation of only loosely related fragments whose larger meaning is lost. So where does that leave us? Helen Glanville, in a truly thought-provoking essay on relativity and restoration, has noted that the multiplicity and mutability of states and meanings within artworks may usefully be understood as a sort of quantum state, that is, a system from which only limited information may be extracted, the nature of which will be influenced by the time, place, and methods of extraction. This, to my mind at least, is a much more useful model for the conservation and consideration of complex artworks, and the process of conservation itself, which necessarily frames or interprets artworks in ways that, in Brandy's words, inadvertently bear witness to the tastes, trends, and fashions of the time. The great challenge of conservation is therefore to preserve, to the extent possible, the many prior states and meanings of an art object without foreclosing the possibility of the future creation or rediscovery of additional states and meanings. For this reason, complex artworks might be best understood as multivalent. That is, their physical states may change as a result of conservation, just as their significance may shift depending on the knowledge brought to bear upon them. But neither of these operations exhausts all possibilities. So here are the two objects after conservation. The short-term goals of stabilizing and cleaning them for display have been achieved, but during the course of treatment, considerable information relevant to the history and interpretation of the objects was brought to light, revealing them to be truly multivalent. By pursuing different methods of inquiry, it is now possible to appreciate them in many different ways, as fragments of lost originals, as material records of 19th century restoration processes, as witnesses to changing tastes and art historical knowledge, as aesthetic objects in their own right. Doubtless, at some future point in time, with further knowledge or insight, additional meanings and connections will be established. So while the day-to-day work of conservation strives to achieve material goals, the lasting influence of the conservation process is the larger collaborative intellectual work of conservators, curators, and conservation scientists to recover, embrace, and preserve the full complexity of objects such as these. Thank you, and thanks particularly to these institutions and individuals.
Such complex stories can't not have left us without questions. I know I certainly have some, but I would like to open first the floor. Anybody else?
So, relative to the Walters collection, which I assume I'm familiar with and perhaps even met, how common is this sort of piecing together to create or try to recreate an artifact, would you say?
That has been one of my great questions and experiences here in Rome, particularly looking back at the United States. As you heard in Lindsay's very kind introduction, I have worked for most of my professional life for large American collections assembled in the 19th century. And these are artworks that came through a fairly small network of dealers, mostly centered on the continent, with kind of London and New York as well. So the art market in the 19th century was overheated in a way that I think we're only beginning to approach now. So the demand far outstripped the supply. There's also much less of a concern with authenticity, which is why we're often faced with such complex objects. So at least within the Walters art collection and many other collections that were assembled at that point in time, particularly in the United States, the presence of these very complex objects is extremely widespread. And it can be very difficult to disentangle what is what, especially when you're working to deadline. So when having the time to kind of think through some of these issues, and particularly being in a place like Rome where there's a much longer tradition of restoration, and there's a much different collecting history and relationship to the past, I think has helped to kind of crystallize my understanding of objects such as these in American collections.
This is fantastic stuff, and congratulations for having wrestled your way through these really complicated objects. Actually, I have a lot of questions. Well, I'll ask you two. The first one is could you go back to your big Adam and Eve relief?
Sure.
I just want to ask you a quick question about your inscription.
Yes.
So is the idea, I mean, there's no reason why you would put an incomplete inscription on or maybe you would in the 19th century, but you wouldn't in the Renaissance, right?
Right.
So that
Where
is
are
the
we?
idea that A, that inscription is original to the original object, and B, that inscription was originally complete? Or is that inscription doesn't belong there at all?
That is a really complicated question.
No.
No. I think that there are some reasons to think that the fragments of the object, although they seem to have been reduced from some larger monument, do cohere together, and they probably did come from the same object initially. As I was speaking earlier about analysis of cobalt glazes and enamels, there's a particular change in impurities associated with cobalt used in the glazes of the Della Robbia workshop with the element arsenic around the year 1520. So again, having to do with different mine sources and different ways of preparing ores, it's possible to have different impurities present. But the long and the short of it is that the blues on that bottom portion where the inscription is are different from those on the relief. But if we accept that it was probably made slightly after 1515, that puts us very close to that date of 1520. So it's sort of neither here nor there. It has been proposed that the architectural surround of the relief is the fragmentary portion. The central kind of figural relief seems to have been both wider and taller, and the kind of the architecture that frames it seems weirdly puny. So it's possible to think of a much wider kind of predella or base that then supported a kind of more elaborate architecture to frame the central scene.
Okay, so this is the hard question, which is that, so for 5 years, I've listened to our fellows in historic preservation and conservation talk in some ways and meditate on the state of their field. And what almost all have been at pains to say is that we, historic preservation and conservation, are not just about freezing an object in time, but we are open to multiple valences of objects and monuments and cities. And they talk about this as though, A, this is a new idea, and B, this is an idea that needs defending. As an archaeologist, I've never understood why this would need defending, because as an archaeologist, your whole reason for being is the palimpsest, and there's no such thing as an original anyway, and most of the world has gotten over that, a long time ago. So talk a little bit about why you as an objects conservator, because a lot of the people who've had this discussion in this room have been buildings conservators or urbanists. Talk a little bit about why you feel you need to have that conversation. What's at stake for you?
When you walk into a museum, particularly a very imposing architectural space like the Walters, like the Met, you walk up those steps through the giant columns, and you're entering a space of authority. And when you approach an object, you can, with no prior information of what it is or where it came from, you have only what your eyes can tell you and maybe the 15 words on the card next to it. And that isn't very much in terms of context that can be communicated to a viewer that is primed to accept the physical state in front of them as definitive and is somehow the only possible presentation of an artwork. So I think particularly for me, working in museum that is free and open to the public in a fairly disadvantaged neighborhood in an inner city, that there is an enormous there's an enormous intellectual hurdle to overcome for most museum visitors to accept that there is more than one way of looking at an artwork or of understanding it. And so much, you're entirely correct that much of what I do and what I was just talking about is on a daily basis is create complexity. And you know, that's something that I revel in. But then at the end of the day, I'm forced to winnow that down to the 5 words that go into the 15-word label, or to create the one diagram that will represent the complexity of an irreducible object. So I think that is in some ways my experience of the kind of tension of creating so much complexity and recognizing so much complexity within my working life, but working within an environment and a system that relies upon kind of concision and clarity and simplicity.
That's not what I thought you were going to say, so that's very
Oh.
Brian had a question.
That's so wonderful, thank you. And I was just so impressed in how you could connect the sort of very detailed scientific analysis with these much larger questions about the field. And I guess I want to push on the relation to this idea from Brandy that all conservators would be introducing their own version of the object. Because you ended on sort of a very neutral position, that it's revealing all states. But I guess building on your answer question, I'm curious about how you see your own role within this larger system in America and also internationally in kind of shaping the contemporary reinterpretation of that object. What are your own biases and limitations?
I'll answer that question in 2 parts. One, the first is and Brandy himself actually frames it in this kind of dual aspect. One is the physical work that we do. As I discussed in the first question, working in collections with these really complicated histories of prior restorations, a lot of the work that I do is grapple with prior restorations that have either created these weird new composite objects or artificially presented an object in a way that we, with additional knowledge or information, now know is no longer the complete story or is no longer the preferred story. Furthermore, many of those restorations that were done in the past were undertaken, as I was sort of saying before, with a primary concern of the aesthetic presentation of the object. There wasn't much concern about undoing them, shall we say. So today, in undoing the 19th century, the 16th century, the ancient kind of approaches to these things, or rethinking them, anything that we as conservators do to change the physical state of an object, we do with the expectation that it will then be undone at some point in the future. So kind of built into our own work is the idea that it will be negated at some point in time. It will be superseded. Apart from that kind of historical aspect of grappling with really problematic restorations, there is, and I think this is probably what you were getting at, the kind of the philosophical aspect of how do we conceive of what it is that we do. And I think that they're kind of 2 sides of the same coin, that with new knowledge, with reconsiderations of artworks, everything is done for its own time, and it doesn't always age well, and that's part of the reason that physical interventions are made to be as easily reversible as possible. That even the intellectual work that's done may be undone or superseded at some point in the future.
One last question for yourself.
Thank you for the nod to the cat and theoretical physics, by the way. My question is actually a very practical one. So I assume that these objects come to you with some kind of assume, or let's hope this thing will live for another 1,000 years or 10,000 years. And then in 10,000 years, we want those charts and an archive system that we have to be universally accessible, understandable to every researcher in the entire world, with meticulous archiving of the chemicals that you have applied in this specific year. And do you see where I'm going? Is there
Yes, absolutely. This is
the richness of all these
yes. Yeah, I mean there are contentious international conferences on this issue. There are many people working because this is an issue also not just for conservators but for curators, for registrars, for all sorts of people working in cultural heritage. And increasingly, it's also not just the physical preservation of one's own records within an institution, but how do we interconnect these things? How do we begin to make meaningful connections among artworks that might be in different institutions and their own individual histories? So it's another of these issues where perhaps the ideal answer, the kind of perfect technology is out there, but it hasn't been worked out yet, and it's dragging behind it all of this, all of the baggage of the analog age and the kind of the dark age of the digital age as well, in which there was a proliferation of information, but in very unstable digital formats. So it's one of the fundamental problems and kind of challenges of the field and of the museum and cultural heritage field more generally.
A fascinating note to end on, and I want to applaud you also for a talk that, as Brian mentioned, will so seamlessly between super technical information and larger philosophical meditations on not just these objects, but your field at writ large. And I enjoyed it very much, and I'm sure everyone did. And we should applaud you for that up at the bar with a drink, where the conversation will continue.
Thank you.